Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Herefordshire Meadows talk this evening with George Peterken and Dan Khan. I'm Caroline Hanks, and I'm the coordinator of Herefordshire Meadows group. And just for those of you who aren't members, who've joined us for this special talk this evening, we are a countryside stewardship facilitation funded group of farmers and smallholders and estate owners in Herefordshire. And we are working to share our knowledge and skills and build up our expertise in managing, restoring and creating all kinds of flower-rich grassland. And we've been going for nearly 6 years now. And we've decided that normally each year we would have a forum at this time of year where we'd meet in the large village hall with 100 or more people and discuss a topic for a morning, and then plan our summer events from the topics that come out of that. But this year we're doing things slightly differently, but we've got a series of talks which we think is very relevant and pertinent to a lot of the discussions going on at the moment about not just meadows and flower-rich grassland as habitats, but mosaics of habitats. And so we're running a series now of talks called Meadows, Mosaics, and Mitigating Climate Change. And we're really keen to try and dive a little bit into the whole issue of carbon sequestration by plants in swards, as well as trees in woodland, trees in wood pasture, in wood meadows, which is why we're here this evening, and also exploring things like shelter for our livestock, things that people are calling living barns, agroforestry, all those kind of topics. So that's what we're going to be concentrating on in the next couple of months. So we're delighted, as I said, to have two speakers with us this evening. Just a very quick bit of housekeeping. I'd like to introduce you to two of my colleagues first. So Sue Holland is here. I think if you speak up, Sue, then you will come up. But Sue Holland is here this evening.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to see you.
And Rory Johnson, a Meadows advisor with our group as well.
Hi everyone. Hi, nice to see you all.
So Rory is keeping an eye on the waiting room and helping us with the IT. Thank you very much. And both Sue and Rory will be looking at the questions that you choose to put in the chat function. So for those of you, I hope everybody knows how to do that, but if you hover over the bottom of your screen, hopefully at the moment you're seeing the first of George's lovely slides. If you hover at the bottom of your screen with your mouse, then the chat button will come up, and it's a bubble, speech bubble. If you click that, you can type where it says type a message to everyone, and you then click the return button at the end of your message, your question, and it'll be there for Sue and Rory to gather them together and put them to George and Dan at the end of their talks. We are recording this meeting so that we can share it with people who aren't able to be here, or you can listen to it again to refresh yourself on the key points as well. So I think that's all the housekeeping we need to do for now. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce both of our speakers this evening. So George Peterken, many of you know, and here George, we'll need to be able to see you. So George Peterken is one of the UK's foremost woodland ecologists, and we're so lucky to have him living here in the Wye Valley. And George has been a fabulous supporter of our group from the start. I think you spoke at our very first forum, didn't you?
I did, yeah.
Yep. When you just published your book, your Meadows book.
Mm-hmm.
But you started out, didn't you, as a woodland on the woodland side?
Yeah, that's right, yes.
So he's worked incredibly hard over many years to really raise the awareness of the importance of ancient woodlands, and worked tirelessly for that for many decades, and been a huge asset to the increased understanding of the importance of broadleaf woodlands in particular. And as I said, he's written a book about meadows, one on the Wye Valley, one of the Collins New Naturalist series. Very importantly and locally, he's set up a wonderful project called the Parish Grasslands Project in the part of the Wye Valley where he lives. And that's really supporting now, extending out and supporting fantastic things like conservation grazing with herds of cattle, isn't it? And all sorts of great things are happening as a result of that interaction and a very large group of people in the Wye Valley who are being supported to manage their meadows in a fantastic way. And we're particularly lucky to have George now, because when I got in touch with you, you were absolutely finishing off your next book.
Yes.
So it's great that that's gone off to the publishers, I think, hasn't it? And you're able to join us this evening. So a big thank you for being here, George. It's wonderful that you can give this talk to us. And then our second speaker this evening is going to be Dan Khan. Dan, I should introduce you. Can you say hello, and then your picture will come up on the screen?
Hello, thanks, Caroline.
This is Dan from the Wood Meadow Trust. He's going to tell us about that organisation, but he's based up in Yorkshire, and he's doing some fantastic work to support people wanting to create and manage wood meadow across a large area, actually, of the country. So it's very, very exciting work, and we're going to hear from him after George's slide. So Dan's an ecologist. He's been working as an ecological consultant for a number of years, and he's been with the Wood Meadow Trust for the last 18 months. So we're absolutely delighted that he can be here this evening. I think what we'll do is George will give his talk. It segues brilliantly into some time for Dan to speak, and then we'll take questions afterwards, if that's okay. So welcome to you both. Audience, please do, welcome to you all this evening. Please do start putting any questions in the chat as we go along, and I'm going to hand over to George now to start his presentation.
Thank you very much, Carla.
Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. I think you've got the gist of me. I'm really a woodland ecologist, but I got so fed up and bored with woodlands about 20 years ago that I turned to other things. Among other things, I turned to meadows and got so seriously interested in that, I ended up writing a book about them. One of the ironies of that is that in getting interested in meadows, I found myself drawn back towards woodland repeatedly. There are all sorts of parallels and connections between woodlands and meadows, and I found that in itself interesting. Now, one of the obvious connections is the subject of this evening. In fact, it's almost built in that someone who's been interested in woodland and meadows should then take an interest in wood meadows. But I have a particular interest in doing this, which I'll come to later on. What I'm going to do this evening, and I hope someone will shout loudly if I'm speaking too fast or too slowly or whatever. What I'm going to do this evening is show you something in the order of 25 slides, and more or less equally divided between the three subjects at the bottom. I thought it was probably important to give you a gist of the character of real wood meadows, traditional wood meadows, as we find them and still find them on parts of mainland Europe. I'll then face the question, did we ever have them in Britain? And if so, in what form? My answer, of course, is we did in some forms, but we never called them that. And then I'm going to go on to the question of how can we get more or new ones if we want them? And this is probably the bit which is going to be of most interest and use to people. So a few slides about traditional wood meadows. And of course, the first slide is one of these. Now, wood meadows is like wood pastures, an intimate mixture of trees and grassland. But in this case, the grass is mown as a meadow before there is some grazing later on in the season. And this is a picture of Tagamoisa, which is one of the preserved wood meadows in Western Estonia. And you can see more or less in one picture the kind of thing it is. You can see that the grass has been cut. You can see it's a nature reserve because they haven't managed to make much use of this hay that was cut, and it's still piled there in a kind of slowly rotting haycock from last year. The grass in that picture is not that well grown yet because Keith Kirby, who's the one pointing there, and myself went there in May, and it was only about 3 weeks after the snowpack had melted. So the grass hadn't had really much time to grow, but there were lots of flowers in it already by then. And you can see the structure, that this is neither woodland nor grassland, neither high forest nor coppice, but a mixture of all three. Now I shall look at several of these pictures and examples just to give you a sense of what these are about. Now, first of all, I thought it was worth making the point that we're quite used to the combination of grassland and trees and woodland, but we call them wood pastures for the very good reason that they are pastures and the grass isn't mown. This is one of your remarkable Herefordshire examples. And here you've got, well, it's basically an oak wood pasture with grassland heavily grazed by sheep at the present time. Now, I think it's quite interesting to note that wood pasture is a term which may well not be that ancient, even though wood pastures themselves are ancient. I would like to put it to the test, and I should have done so before this talk, but I wouldn't mind betting that if you start looking at woodland ecology papers and things before 1970, you'll find very few mentions of wood pasture. We didn't really know what to call them. But this is one of the terms which Oliver Rackham erected in one of his earliest books. It's been part of the discourse ever since, and it's given them an identity, which I think is important. One of the things I want to do with wood meadows is to give them an identity as well, because I think that makes it easier for people to talk about them, to understand them, to do something about them should they wish, and not feel as if they're so out on a limb that they almost need to apologize for their actions. So wood pasture came in, and we now all know what we're talking about, and wood pasture is quite an important subject in woodland nature conservation. Let us now talk about wood meadows. Now, this is a kind of management which was extremely abundant, certainly around the Baltic. These are pictures from Sweden, but I think one could have got exactly the same sort of pictures from other countries around the Baltic. In Sweden in particular, and the wood meadows came in a variety of forms. At one end of the scale is simple coppice wood meadow, which is pictured in the bottom left. And that's exactly what it says. The trees are coppice repeatedly, the grass is mown, and the trees and the grass are mixed together. At the other end of the scale, you get pollard wood meadows, and there are several pictures here, top right, which I've got obscured on my screen, but I think I can get it. Yeah, top right. That is a pollard wood meadow, which is in effect a kind of Mockers Park, but they pollard the trees and mow the grass. It's a kind of parkland of mature trees. There's very little shrubland. Most of what these wood meadows were was something in between, and with the addition of fruit trees. In fact, an essential component of wood meadows was the presence of fruit trees, so that in the other pictures you can see you've got both pollards and coppice, and you've also got the sign in that wooden fencing that the ground is actually grazed, but the grass is actually initially mown. I'll go through the cycle of management in a moment. But the point to make really is that wood meadows come in a multitude of forms, which are combinations of trees, which are usually pollarded, but not necessarily, shrubs or underwood, which is coppiced, grass, which is treated as a meadow, that's to say mown in midsummer and grazed later on in the year, and fruit trees, which yield a whole variety of things, like, among other things, pollen for the bees, which would also have been kept within the wood meadow. So several components. Now, I hope this is clear. I lifted it from someone's paper, and I hope it makes sense. When we're thinking about, we're talking here about one of the types of wood meadow, the coppice wood meadow. In fact, this is, as it were, coppice with standards wood meadow. And that is run on two interlocking rotations. On the right, you have an annual rotation in which the grass take the panel 2 in that. They make the hay in summer. And since this is an antiquated management system, they did it with scythes, of course. Make the hay in summer. They graze it later in the year. And this being Estonia, it gets covered in snow and you can't graze it beyond the autumn. But as soon as they get the chance in early spring, they'll be raking the ground clear of leaves and twigs, fallen twigs and the like. They'll burn them and they will distribute the ash as a kind of fertilizer. And that's important because the dual presence of trees with grassland has the benefit on the grassland of increasing productivity. The trees root to greater depths than the grass. They drag up nutrients from depth, but they deposit it on the surface in the form of leaves, which are then a source of nutrients, but you have to rake them off, otherwise it spoils the grass. So this is labor intensive, there's no doubt about that, but they got a lot out of it. They got this benefit of having a lot of wood, a lot of grass, supplementary things like beekeeping and fruit, that's such like. And the trees, at least traditionally, were also a source of leaf fodder. In other words, the primary purpose, as I understand it, of wood meadows is to make hay, either in the form of grass hay or leaf fodder. Now, that made a lot of sense in Estonia and Sweden and such like, which have very long winters and a very great need for hay. And the further west you go, in Sweden, the less likely you are to have pollard trees because they didn't need so much hay because the winters were less severe. So it makes sense that we didn't actually adopt wood meadows as a management system in Britain. We just had better grazing through the winter and didn't need so much hay, it would seem. Now the other panel shows the other rotation, which is the tree rotation, which in a sense is an ordinary coppice with standards rotation. You let the coppice grow, cut it every 20 years or so, use the sticks and the leaves as you think fit, fell some of the standard trees when you fell the coppice, but leave most of them each time. Do this on a 20-year rotation. And when you put these two together, what you get is a kind of fluctuating habitat. It's never stable. Immediately after the coppice has been cut in any given area, the grass suddenly gets a boost because it has more light. Grassland species expand, woodland plants contract. But as the coppice regrows, that process goes into reverse. And in fact, in many cases, the rotation of the trees is determined by the need to revive the haymaking under the grass underneath those trees. You don't let them shade for too long. Excuse me. So this is a highly integrated system, and you end up with an extremely intimate mixture of trees, shrubs, and grass, which produces all sorts of goods each year. And because the trees benefit the grass, the hay produced there is actually quite substantial in volume. And I'm afraid I haven't seen any pictures, any figures saying how much the haymaking, how much the hay production was on a given area compared with meadows, compared with wood meadows. But I wouldn't mind betting that wood meadows didn't produce much less hay. Of course, this is the Scandinavian countries, which were covered in glaciers and things at one point. So in practice, a lot of these trees grow on ground which is a bit bouldery, and the grass is on the slightly deeper pockets of soil. It makes sense. This is actually an efficient way of using a rather a sort of boulder littered landscape. So I hope that makes some sense. Some pictures, what do they look like? These are my first sightings of wood meadows. First one was on the left. I was going there to see woodlands of various kind, and I was shown this thing literally in passing. We were driving down the road and someone said, "Do you want to see a wood meadow?" So I said, "Yes, please." And this is what I saw. Now, these are slide scanned, and they're not particularly good, but the thing that really struck me was that this was simply a wonderfully attractive environment. And secondly, it was full of flowers. The one I took a picture of was the military orchid. I just couldn't get over the fact that this was seething with military orchids. I thought, this is strange. This is a woodland, but it's military orchids. And military orchids are a plant which hovers between being a woodland plant and a grassland plant in Britain. Here it is, it's got both. And here on the top right, you see a pollard meadow, but in Bulgaria. This is up in the hills, which gives me an opportunity to say that wood meadows are not just around the Baltic. They're actually all over mainland Europe. But the further south you go, the more likely they were to be, as it were, in the hills. So they're a kind of way of using hill land for farming. How do I get rid of this thing here?
You can minimize it.
Okay, that's it.
Okay.
Now here's a panel of pictures from Lailatu wood meadow, which is another one of the Estonian wood meadows. The air photograph on the right, which was taken off the display panel at the entrance to the reserve, and this is a nature reserve. Incidentally, they have really good and informative boards telling you what's in these reserves, very high quality, far surpassing anything one sees here. And I can't see why we don't do this sort of thing here. But anyway, there is an air photograph of the meadow. It shows within the yellow the bits that they are maintaining as a traditional wood meadow, and the other bits which they have perforce been allowed to grow into woodland because they haven't got the resources to mow the grass all through this. On the top left, you see again a structure of a wood meadow. This is within that, probably right bang in the center actually of that air photograph there. Gives you some idea of the structure of the place. And incidentally, this is probably the place where there's the world record count for the number of vascular plant species seen in 1 meter square, which from memory comes out at something like 70 species or thereabouts. Can you imagine that? 1 meter square and 70 different plants listed within it. Another picture down bottom left, which I mean, the structure is not the same throughout. And then there's proof, as one finds as one wanders around these places, that they did make hay. They've got a rake there. And in this case, I think they extracted the hay and used it somewhere, but I can't tell you where. Now, wood meadows were very abundant. They took up about 1/3 of the whole of Estonian landscape in the 18th century, I read. But of course, they've greatly diminished, not at all in tune with sort of modern lifestyles. And most of these have either been cleared to collective fields during the Soviet era, or they've reverted to woodland. So you can go to wood after wood in Estonia and see places that were wood meadows. And these are the kind of a variety of structures that one can see when doing that. I wouldn't mind betting, I'm afraid I didn't have time to go into every last detail. I wouldn't mind betting that all these pictures you see here are taken in woods which were wood meadows. And the last slide of traditional wood meadows I want to show you is this one, which is trying to emphasize the fact that the flora is really outstanding in these wood meadows. Now, this is a photo which Bob Gibbons has kindly allowed me to use in talks. I've got one which is almost as good, but it's a kind of rule of life that one's photographs are never quite as good as Bob Gibbons's photographs. And in this case, I thought it best to just show you a really fine picture of ladies' slippers, which one finds routinely in Estonian wood meadows, and another picture of the general structure, which is neither meadow nor woodland, but something in between. And being a kind of mixture of habitats which are constantly fluctuating because of the management, one completely loses this distinction between grassland plants and woodland plants that we so easily slip into in Britain. To take an example, I found herb Paris growing out in the middle of the open areas in this wood meadow, which is unheard of in Britain. You can find lily of the valley growing out in perfectly good meadows, and I wouldn't mind betting that none of you think of lily of the valley as a grassland plant. And it's because these are a mixture of habitats intimately connected in a mosaic like this, and because they're constantly, as it were, moving and changing from becoming a bit more woodland or a bit more grassland as the habitat changes, that they retain this mixture. Now, the real question is this relevant at all to Britain? Was it that we didn't have them, or simply didn't call what we had wood meadows? Well, I've got a few slides here which demonstrate that we had habitats which were wood meadow-like. In other words, if we choose to create wood meadows in Britain now, we wouldn't be creating a precedent. We had them, we never called them that. And we never called them that, I suspect, simply because they weren't technically the wood meadows of Scandinavian type or the organized habitats that they had. Oops, hope I haven't buggered the works there. Hit the wrong button. I came across this picture a few years ago. In fact, to be honest, it's my wife who came across it. She's the landscape painter. George Clausen was, I think, the person who was the artist who was knighted for decorating the House of the Commons. I read that he lived in Sussex, so I'm assuming that this is a picture from a Wealden woodland, which of course is an intimate mixture of fields and woodlands. And a picture which shows haymaking visibly within a woodland context. The ladies, or at least the two ladies, are evidently a bit tired, and I sympathise with that. I've done quite a lot of raking of hay in my own meadows recently, and I'm knackered. The man sides on, but what he's showing is that here we have a perfectly good wood meadow. I wouldn't mind betting the term has never crossed their mind or anybody else's in Sussex or anywhere else. And here is quite a different thing. I don't know whether you'll agree with me here, but this is actually a stained glass window dating from 1410. And you can find it if you get off the train in York and walk not very far into All Saints Church. And there, on the opposite side from the entrance porch, you find this stained glass window, which is apparently called the Prick of Conscience window. There are 15 panels to it, and they essentially display the nature of doom. And this is at one point where trees are raining blood or whatever is how it's described. You can see the droplets there. What we have, though, is the scatter of big trees over herbage of varying structure, which to my mind looks like a wood meadow. Now, I'm sure this is straining the point far too far, but it's curious that they should choose to illustrate it like that. Later panels, of course, show very much worse things happening. None of it ends well. And then again, if you look into the Doomsday Book records, one of the things which strikes one very quickly is that the two habitats which were particularly mentioned are meadows and woodland. And the woodland could be either wood pasture or it could be coppice. I've quoted an example at the top in which, in the parish of Hatton in central Lincolnshire, there's both underwood, that's coppice, and meadows mentioned. And lo and behold, if you go there now and find Little Scrubs Wood, you find a meadow right by it. Now, whether that's coincidence or not, I don't know. I'm quite pleased with that meadow because when I first went there to study the limewoods, that meadow was stocked with Corsican pine, but they'd only been planted 3 years previously. So I tipped off the trusts and they negotiated it back to what it is now, Little Scrubs Meadow, and a fine meadow it is too. And that reminds me that there are lots of physical connections between real meadows and real ancient woods. You often find a small meadow by an ancient wood. You can find small meadows within an ancient wood. If you go to Bradfield Woods Reserve in Suffolk now, you can actually find these same lawns within meadows, which were once within the wood, which were once meadows. Another association with trees and meadow. This is a picture which I put on simply because I like it, to be honest. It shows a scene in the Cotswolds in which haymaking is going on in a meadow, which is intimately mixed with the Cotswold woods. You can see the whole process there. And again, this is a strong association between meadows and ancient woodland. Coming down nearer to our interests and time, this is a picture now of a large wood in well, it's not actually technically in Gloucestershire anymore, but it's run by the Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust as a major nature reserve. Running through that is a large grassy trench, they call it. You could call it a ride, but it's actually an ancient road which is kept as a linear strip of grassland of varying width within the wood. And this was mown for hay, and the trust still mow parts of it for hay. This is a hay meadow within a substantial ancient wood. And this intimate association of meadow-like grassland and ancient woodland can be seen in a quite different form. Here we are in Wharfdale, just above Grasswood, near Grassington, and just above, Grasswood and Bastow Wood are actually contiguous, but Bastow Wood is actually grazed in late summer and was a woodland and seems to be maintained in this sort of halfway house between woodland and grassland. And I think you'll admit it's actually a rather fine piece of grassland or a nice piece of diverse woodland, whatever you care to call it, but it is the same intimate mixture of meadow or meadow-like grassland and ancient woodland in the form of coppice. Incidentally, I think there's a continuity between meadow and pasture, and late grazed pasture is de facto meadow as far as plants are concerned, quite a lot of the fauna. And then something which may be even more familiar and certainly much better distributed. Go into churchyard after churchyard and you find grass and trees and shrubs intimately mixed. In some places, you find really wonderful meadows, first-rate meadows. This one happens to be in Worcestershire. And not only has a meadow like this, it actually has one of these ancient yew trees situated around a pool, a spring. In other words, it has all the associations a top-class churchyard should have. But I see these as a sort of wood meadow as well. Why not? Trees, shrubs, meadow. So I hope I've done enough to say that meadows and trees in various forms have been intermixed in the British landscape for a long time. We could go into this in much greater detail, but we haven't got all night. I also wanted to point out before I go into the creating wood meadows bit of the talk, that most meadows, traditional meadows, were associations of grassland and trees, simply because the boundaries of those meadows were stocked with shrubs of various kinds, trees of various ages and sizes. And we've lost sight of that a bit now because so many of the farmland trees were removed after the Second World War, but they still find places where you do see this association. So in trying to associate trees with meadows, one is not doing anything new at all. Now, what I'm going to do now is just show you a few slides briefly about how wood meadow-like vegetation has been created in Britain, just to show that this kind of thing is possible. And of course, you've got starting points of woodland or grassland, and you can start with arable, and I'll look at all three. let's start with woodland. Now, this is a slide which I've never put this to the test, but I'm quite sure if I showed this to an audience of Estonian ecologists and said it was an Estonian wood meadow, absolutely no one would blink. It's actually in North Norfolk. It's one of the finest ancient woods in East Anglia. And when I first got to know it in the early 70s, we were trying to negotiate with Lord Hastings to make it into a national nature reserve. He was still particularly interested in maintaining this wood as a game shoot, pheasant shooting. So we negotiated an agreement, the details of which I'm not privy to, but it involved widening the rides, which he did in an irregular fashion, so that rather like that trench running through lower woods, the rides in Swanton-Nova's National Nature Reserve, as it now is, are irregular width. Now, clearly they are mown in some form, and I don't know what the current management regime is. Certainly parts of the wood are still coppiced. When I saw them, the woods were coppiced to make bundles of brushwood, which were used pinned down to the beds of fenland rivers to stop the banks eroding, fascines they were called. And here is a wood meadow in effect. They didn't set out, they didn't have wood meadow as a concept in their mind, but by doing the simple business of widening the rides and doing it irregularly, continuing a bit of coppicing, they've created something which is as good a wood meadow as you'll see anywhere in Britain, a national nature reserve. And here's another national nature reserve, but this time photographed in winter. This is where I used to work, Monkswood National Nature Reserve, or rather a research station beside it. Now, the origin of this wood meadow, as I now call it, was a wartime emergency. People needed food. The owners of this wood were obliged to clear 2 chunks of it and grow potatoes in the cleared land. And they did this for 2 or 3 years and then abandoned it. Shortly after, it became a national nature reserve. The reserve managers fortunately decided to keep these clearings as rough grassland. They were grazed intermittently, but now they're quite systematically mown, and they have a wood meadow because within this grassland, a certain amount of shrubbery has grown up. Some trees were allowed to persist, and you can see the equipment down in the panel lower left. This really is managed as a meadow. Now, again, Natural England, as it now is, created this without having any label, wood meadow, for it, but that's what they've produced. And my contention with this talk is that if we have the label wood meadow, we'll know what we're up to, and that'll be a useful facilitator for doing more of this. Another one a bit closer to Herefordshire, possibly photographable within Herefordshire if I knew where to go. But in the wire forest, there are small holdings, which have probably been there for, I don't know, 200 or 300 years at a guess. I should have looked this up, I suppose. And latterly, they were used as orchards. And you can see here an old orchard, which was degenerating. I mean, the wire forest was taken over by Forestry Commission by and large, with some of private. How am I doing for time?
No, fine. George.
Okay. It was taken over by the Forestry Commission. The southeast quarter, which is, I think, where this is, remained in private hands, but I don't think the farming was taken very seriously. It's now a national nature reserve, and either the Natural England or the Forestry Commission, or I think there's a trust arrangement, has been created to look after the farmland within the perimeter of the wire forest. Whatever, whoever's managing this is clearly mowing the ground for hay and also restoring in stages the orchard, leaving as many of the old trees as possible for as long as possible. Now, although that is a highly managed and contrived system, we created it, but I would say that this is very much in the spirit of wood meadows, even in the Scandinavian sense. They were full of fruit trees. I don't ever remember seeing anything which was pure fruit trees and no forest trees, but at least you've got two of the main components there, meadow and orchard trees. And I think you can stretch a point and simply call this another form of British wood meadow. And then now this is Herefordshire. It shows another route by which, in this case, grassland has become a form of wood meadow. At Checkley, as I understand it, and I hardly know the place, I just took a photograph. It looks to me as if the owner of the land actually planted a few trees as ornament. In other words, created a kind of attractive parkland and thereby incorporated trees and brought them into sort of intimate contact with an excellent meadow. And that really is a very fine meadow, or was when I last saw it. In contrast, at Broadmoor Common, and this is also on the Woolhope Dome, you have a common which I think must have fallen out of its traditional use. The grazing declined. Period of neglect allowed scrub of various kinds to grow in. And then this process went into reverse. And again, I don't know the local discussions or how it happened, but this is now known as a meadow. And whoever was in charge of that had the wit, thankfully. That's my way of putting it. But I'm very pleased that they actually kept parts of the sort of scrub that had developed and laid this out in effect with winding paths, winding stretches of grass, so that again, they've created an intimate mixture of trees, shrubs, and meadowland. Broadmoor Common has become an excellent wood meadow. And just to show you another one, it's not just hereabouts, this is Scotland, central Perthshire. This is not very far from the Fortingall Yew, if you ever want to see an amazing tree. But the Scottish Wildlife Trust has got this meadow, and they have allowed the trees to infiltrate into roughly half of their property to create something which is a substantial meadow, and it's very, very flowery, and it then grades into a kind of wood meadow effect in the other half. Now, I've taken this photograph in the meadow part, not the tree part, but you get the idea that this is again both woodland and meadow and things in between. I call that a wood meadow. Now, thirdly, it has been possible to create wood meadows from scratch. And this is the project which Dan is here, and I imagine is wanting to say a few things about. And I think the owner of the land, Rosalind Forbes Adam, and her husband, who own the Escrick estate, they it were who conceived the idea of converting what a little over a decade ago was a perfectly ordinary arable field into a meadow with trees. Now, I've been coming along to this, well, it was well underway when I first saw it. And the thing that struck me when I saw it was, good heavens, this is actually not unlike the wood meadows I'd recently been looking at in Sweden and in Estonia. And I think the idea lodged with Rosalind, and ever since she's called this a wood meadow. And I find myself having, as it were, conferred an identity on this project. Now, the map on the left, or rather the air photograph on the left, explains the general configuration. The field is between a road and a woodland in the background there. So it's got trees in the surroundings, but no trees within the project originally. The land was properly examined, tested, different soil types were identified within the area, and then with ecological advice available, the attempt was made to create two different types of meadow, and you see, if you can just see the small print, MG4 and MG5 in those two bigger patches of grass. And these are imitating the types of grassland, MG4 and MG5, which you see described in the National Vegetation Classification. Broadly speaking, MG4 is floodplain meadow grassland, and MG5 is ordinary meadows, as it were, if there are such things as ordinary meadows these days. And much of the ground has been planted with trees, which are also carefully selected to create mixtures which are appropriate to the soil. Linking the two meadows are strips of grassland, and there are tracks through the woodland. In fact, the whole thing is laid out, as you see, as an intimate mix of trees, grassland, and trees and grassland, and out of sight to the top is a fairly substantial pond, which was also created. Now, as I say, this was started, if it's more than a decade ago, it's only just. And they've got a perfectly good meadow, as you can see on the right. It's been like that for a few years. It's really attractive, and it's attractive very quickly. I can tell it's not an old meadow because it hasn't yet developed the kind of clustering effect of plant species within it, which are characteristic of old meadows. It's a very even mix through quite a lot of it, but it's nevertheless an attractive meadow, and it's getting better year by year. Let's have a look at some more pictures of it. Without going into great detail, and these are all supplied by the Wood Meadow Trust, you can see different views within this. Some of the woodland has become, well, real woodland. It's closed canopy. And in fact, there's the beginnings of a program of coppicing starting. Other parts of the woodland have hardly got going. They kind of sit there perfectly healthy, but rather static. And these are now currently a very attractive form of herb-rich meadow and shrubs, but eventually that'll be woodland, and that'll, I understand the management plans, that'll be coppiced. And you can see, if you remember the pattern, that this will very soon become kind of almost a traditional Scandinavian wood meadow. Bottom right, you see another view of the actual meadow itself with the yellow rattle in it, which is helping to keep the grasses in check. And what these pictures don't show is that certainly whenever I've been there, the place has been full of people. The wood meadow has been used for outreach studies, for school programs, for open days, for people just wanting to exercise, work parties. And you can see two examples of people, well, at least gaining some exercise. In fact, I rather envy that scythesman because he's a damn sight better at it than I am, I would say, or rather he's got a very much sharper blade than I've managed on my side. So there's a lot more to this, but I'm not the authority, and one of the authorities, or two of the authorities, are right here joining this meeting, so I'll leave it to them. So finally, what I'll do is to show you, in a sense, part of the ambitions of the Wood Meadow Trust. I mean, originally this was simply the Hagwood Meadow, which is the local place name. But seeing as how this was an idea which was worth promoting to other landowners, a Wood Meadow Trust has been formed, and they're offering as a service, I think, to anybody else who's interested, advice on how they've done their project and how other people might do theirs. But I think throughout there is flexibility in all this. They're not telling you what to do. I think I've said enough to show you that Wood Meadows is a variable feast. Even in Scandinavia, it was very diverse. There are all sorts of different subtypes of wood meadow. In Britain, where we take a rather flexible view of what counts as a wood meadow, it's even more diverse. So there's no fixed recipe for doing this, but there are ideas which can be put together and put into practice. And I think the Wood Meadow Trust is there hoping to promote the idea and to offer help should help be sought. So maybe out of this, there will be a chance for a few yellow dots somewhere in the southern part of the English parts of the Welsh borderland. Now at this point, I think I will hand over to, I think Dan wants to say a few words, probably to correct what I've just said. But I hope I've said enough to say that I think wood meadows is an interesting idea. It embodies the intimate mixing of trees and grassland. And as far as the flora is concerned, it produces, or has produced in the old wood meadows, a most amazingly diverse flora. How it works out for the fauna, I really don't have much information on that. I just know that at the Hag Woods project, careful monitoring has gone on of all the species which have been recorded there. And each year, I think, the diversity of the native fauna and flora has been building up. But I think here I ought to leave that to the experts. So I'll answer questions on this, but really it's up to you. If you want to do anything which mixes trees and grassland, there are plenty of precedents and there's some advice around if you want it. Thank you.
Thank you, George, very, very much. Fantastic talk. We're going to let you have a bit of a rest, have your tea.
Drink my
and ask
cold
Dan
tea now.
if you want to unmute yourself and continue, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. Wow, that was fascinating for me to listen to your talk, George. Thank you. And thanks for that brilliant introduction. I think you did it. George has done a fantastic job describing the extraordinary value of wood meadows in terms of floristic diversity and their wildlife value, and given a good overview of some of the huge variety of kind of cultural wood meadow types that exist across Europe. And I'd second what he was just saying there, that the fact that wood meadows are relatively unknown as a concept in the UK is actually something to be quite excited about, because we don't have these strict cultural definitions that we have to stick to. We can adopt a somewhat looser idea of what a wood meadow should be. And so as a charity, we try to encourage people to create dynamic habitat mosaics, incorporating elements of both woodland and meadow, but very much are not setting out to try to force people to replicate exactly what we've done at our site that George was just showing you. I really like the title of your talk series, by the way. What was it? Meadows, Mosaics and Mitigating Climate Change.
Yeah, that's Sue's title. It's fabulous. All the three M's.
Well, I don't think mosaics get anywhere near enough attention. Ecologists tend to get quite excited about mosaics, and there's this principle within habitat management and habitat creation that's really quite widespread, of a mosaic approach being some kind of optimal ideal when it comes to supporting the greatest diversity of biodiversity. That if you have a variety of habitats and transitions between habitats with lots of messy edges, as opposed to something that's quite uniform, that will suit certain specialist species very well, as soon as you mix one habitat with another, you find that something magical happens at those edge points, and that there's a synergistic benefit where a whole spectrum of different microhabitats and microclimatic conditions can occur at the interface between two habitats. And yes, like I was saying, ecologists are very keen on this idea, but it can be a little bit complex, and we've got our own language that we use to describe it. And one of the things that I really like about the wood meadow term is that it's quite intuitive, and something that George has said previously is the value that an intuitive term can have as a vehicle for a concept. And so ancient woodland is a brilliant example of that. I think everybody on the call has probably heard of ancient woodland and has some idea of the value, thanks to George's work, of the importance of ancient woodland as opposed to secondary woodland. And so I think wood meadow as a term has some similar potential if we allow it to be a fairly loose and abstract concept. I think that it's quite an interesting time to be working in our sector because climate change and the climate crisis is on everybody's mind. And it's never been easier to plant trees, which is exciting, but at the same time, sometimes leads to some poor decisions. I think in this push to sequester as much carbon as possible, sometimes other habitats such as meadows, which actually are probably in a far worse state nationally than our woodlands, or in terms of our overall cover, woodland cover is increasing, and yet quite often species-rich meadows still get planted on because there's this idea that to plant a tree is intrinsically good because it's such an accessible idea. So very often trees and woodlands are not planted in a way that's especially sympathetic for wildlife. And very often other habitats like meadows and grasslands get neglected. So I think there's some really important and valuable work to be done by promoting this concept of a wood meadow. And what my role at the Trust focuses on is working with councils and landowners and community groups and farmers to try to encourage people to set up their own wood meadow projects. And one of the things that I'm working on at the moment, and this screenshot is a kind of preliminary view, we hope to set up a UK network of wood meadows, which will, on the one hand, be a map that anybody can access on the internet to look for wood meadow projects to visit. And if any of you feel inspired after George's talk to set up your own wood meadow project, please do get in touch, as we'd love to feature you on the network. And we're in the process of setting up some training courses and guidance materials that, if we get you on our mailing list, I'd very happily share with you. And ultimately, once we've got that network up and running, I'm hoping that it can function as a bit of a support network as well. So a space for knowledge sharing and putting people in touch with one another. Certainly already some of the projects that I've been working with have been helping newer projects by sharing green hay and offering advice on equipment and contractors. So that's it from me, really. Just a shout out, if you do decide to pursue this further, please do get in touch and let us know what you're doing.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan. That's fantastic. Wonderful work that you're doing. I really liked, it was wonderful to see those pictures of how quickly things have developed as well on the site at Hagwood. It's great. Did I understand that had been an arable field before until 10 years ago?
Well, that's right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I think if you've been there 11 years ago, you'd have seen barley, would you, or something like that? I don't know what the crop was, but you get the idea.
That's right. It was a barley field and quite nutrient rich as well. We still have very high phosphate index on site.
Oh, how high? Come on, this is Herefordshire. We can do better than you. What's your...
The last time it was measured, we ranged between 3 and 5 on the Olsen index of phosphate availability.
Great. And look at those results. That's fantastic. That's not what the all the books say, is it, about suitability for creating a flower-rich grass? And so that's really encouraging, because that's been our experience in some cases in Herefordshire as well. So fantastic. Okay. So now I'm going to ask Sue and Rory alternately perhaps to bring forward some of the questions. And we've had a good lot of questions, haven't we, on a lot of topics. Sue, do you want to start?
Yes, we have. We've had some interesting questions, and perhaps leading on from what Dan was saying about meadows and tree planting, we've had a couple about tree planting. This one is from Ed Cooper, and I think see what you say. Ed wonders, if you already have a fine meadow, would you regard planting trees in it as a positive action? And related to that, we have Sarah Marriott is restoring a 14-acre site, 4 fields of a small holding, and she's wondering whether she should divert her meadow restoration sort of plans to more sort of wood meadow as a final habitat. But she doesn't say, I'm assuming that it's not a species-rich meadow to start with because she's restoring it. But I think the planting of trees on the existing good quality meadow is something that is perhaps a lot of us would like you to talk about.
George, do you want to say something first?
Well, I agree. This is sort of nub of the practical problem in many ways. Meadows have been so under the cosh now for decades that there is really very little left. And we want to essentially keep everything we've got as best we can. Ideally, I would still like these to be cut as meadows and treated as meadows. There's not enough to be doing something else with, if you see what I mean. If, however, this is something which is totally useless as a practical farming, it's entirely a hobby and an expense to keep it going as a meadow. If an owner has a wish to have a certain number of trees and shrubs with it to diversify it from being, shall we say, a rectangular piece of flowery grassland into something else, I don't see any real objection to, as it were, bending with the wind a little, planting some native shrubs, I would hope, or marginal positions, creating a diverse edge, and building up a kind of, and sacrificing a little bit of meadow in return for some habitat diversity concentrated on the margins. It's really a question of by what means can we keep the meadow best? What's the optimum for keeping the meadow? And if and that would be, as it were, one way in which I would compromise, I suppose I would call it. However, what I'm hoping that people will recognize is that you don't have to wait forever to get something which is really attractive and potentially quite rich. If the project on the Escrick estate has shown anything, it is that you can get something very attractive within, well, working lifetimes, certainly within a decade, and it's been well worth looking at and visiting for the last 4 or 5 years, I would say, certainly in my experience. In other words, it's not one of these things like planting a wood and then having to go away and come back in several decades later to find it really is a woodland. Before that, it's just a scatter of small trees. Here, as a wood meadow, you get something very, very fine very quickly. So that what I would like to think of is that if we're going to try and create a lot of new ones, I think we ought to do our best to do this on grassland which is not in the top quality hay meadow range, but in the grassland which is of, well, semi-improved, as it often gets called, improved grassland lays, or even from arable. And experience of this particular project, and I hope others, would show that we can get something worthwhile quite quickly. Clearly, it's something that has to be negotiated and something to be debated, but I'm really trying to set an idea going with giving this kind of talk and promoting wood meadows. I'm no longer actually in the sort of age bracket which knows exactly what the most practicable solution is, but my general philosophy is always to recognize that the perfect solution from one point of view may be a damaging solution from another point of view. I'm always prepared to compromise. I've had quite a lot of trouble in my career in conservation because of this willingness to compromise in various ways. But I think in a sense, wood meadow is actually not just a compromise, somewhere between grassland and woodland. It is actually something which is better than both in many cases. And I think you should bear that in mind. But starting with a herb-rich wood meadow in the first place, I think I would do the minimum addition of trees, whereas starting with a woodland, I would be creating as much open space within the wood as I could, and creating the meadow elements and so on. It's treat the circumstances as they are, and remember that the ambitions of the people who own the ground and who are going, after all, to be responsible for keeping this going and sustaining interest do have to be taken into account. And if they want a few trees, then maybe a bit of give and take is worthwhile.
Dan, do you want? Thank you very much, George. Dan, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I thought that's fantastic.
Okay.
I suppose one thing I'd mention is that from a farming perspective, I think there probably is a place for wood meadow type systems within productive farming systems also. And the agroforestry as a concept is gathering quite a lot of momentum at the moment. And there's more and more research coming forward about the various health benefits to livestock from having access to browse with trees and shrubs.
Absolutely. Yes, that's interesting, Dan. I think we've got some questions coming about how to work livestock into this system, but I'm interested, George, you talked about a late grazed wood pasture is actually a meadow in effect, isn't it?
I mean, the first thing that struck me when I got interested in meadows was that there was a real distinction had to be made between hay meadows, which actually literally were cut for hay, and what I call meadow-like grassland, places which produce biologically the same benefits as meadows, and in many cases actually produced more diverse fauna and flora. And among other things, a grassland which is treated as pasture, never actually mown for hay, but if it's grazed late in the season, it achieves what hay meadows do, which is to flower and fruit in the early part of the summer, and then and retain their diversity by being able to do that. So in other words, within the concept of wood meadow, I would happily include an element of pasturage, provided that was late season pasturage, like after July or something like from July onwards. And that would achieve the same results biologically, I believe. Of course, people ought to look into this properly, but I'm just sensing what kind of answer I would get if I did proper research on it. And I think that would be true.
It would be fascinating, wouldn't it? I think that's a really good PhD topic. Is that what you were thinking of, Dan, in terms of, this sounds very like what a number of farmers who are farming more regeneratively are doing. They're perhaps leaving the most flower-rich grazing they've got until later in the season, so that they benefit from all that seeding that's going on, and they are deliberately running a big mob through quickly to graze the long, tall, flowery grassland. And if a big mob goes through quickly, it's going to do less damage perhaps to the shrubs. Is that what you were thinking of it? They're profitable and productive, those farmers, aren't they?
I wasn't thinking that much detail, but it's an absolutely fantastic point. And I'd also say that within a meadow context, as well as a wood meadow context, if you can leave some areas, save them from the hay cut, not a large proportion, but some areas of the site, if they are only grazed in that late burst of grazing as opposed to being cut, it can promote a structure that enables invertebrates to overwinter within that thatch. For example, a lot of butterfly species that we associate with meadows, they don't cease to exist through the winter, and they need those marginal areas of slightly tusky ground for the larvae or the eggs to persist through the year. So if you can incorporate a few slightly rough areas or messy edges within your management system, it goes a long way towards boosting that invertebrate population each year.
Great, that's a great point.
Yeah, I think it's worth remembering that from some people's point of view, some interest point of view, meadows are a disaster because at the height of the summer, their entire habitat is destroyed by mowing and carting off to a barn. It's the margins of meadows which retain the diversity. That's where the butterflies and things live. It's in the margins and that sort of thing. If you count the number of species in the whole meadow unit, a lot of them are actually in the margin of the hedge and the immediate environment of the hedge. In other words, I think the Germans call it a Zaum or something like that, the borderline. And all I'm doing is saying that I think it would be valuable to think in terms of a larger boundary to a meadow created by adding some trees, making it an irregular edge. And I think that gives you the maximum diversity. But let's face it. Have you ever seen these poor meadow browns fluttering around disconsolately after the hay is cut? As long as there's a margin there and that kind of thing, you give them a respite. And remember, a lot of the woodland, a lot of the special butterflies are actually associated with this wood margins, overgrown hedges and the like. They are the species which actually go for these sort of mixture habitats, the two bits and pieces together. And you would be benefiting them surely if you had a bit more trees associated with the margins of even the best hay meadows.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you very much. So I hope we haven't gone right into your question area. Rory, have you got a new, the next question, please? Next group of them.
Yeah, I was just, as we've been talking about grazing within wood meadows, we've actually got a couple of specific grazing related questions. So first one from Catherine Jansen is curious to know whether the coppice stalls are protected in any way if there is grazing after the hay cut. And then also a question from Samantha Sandberg asking about planting cherry trees and other members of the prunus family in a wood meadow, and whether this limits the ability to still be able to graze with cattle, sheep, and possibly horses after the hay crop is taken, or whether there's too much risk of them potentially eating the bark because there's not enough aftermath grazing, and the arsenic within the bark obviously being detrimental to their health.
Right.
Well, you're getting a bit beyond the margins of my competence here, but let me just make one or two remarks and then you better fill in. You probably remember one of the early pictures, in fact, the black and white pictures right at the beginning. You did actually see fencing within a wood meadow. And as I understand it, it was a normal part of the wood meadow system, especially the coppice meadows, for parts of the wood meadow to be fenced off immediately after coppicing. In other words, they treated it like any other big coppice used to be treated, which is exclusion of the part of grazing animals through the immediate aftermath of coppicing, so that the new shoots could get a reasonable start. So it would be in the tradition of wood meadows if there was some fencing and protection for coppice stalls. Now, I'm afraid I'm not competent to talk in detail about pasturage within woodlands, or whether mob grazing actually does mete out less damage to trees and shrubs than prolonged grazing, but it sounds to me as if it ought to. I mean, ought to be a better recipe than allowing, I don't know, say sheep in there for all the winter. That would be disastrous for coppice regrowth. So I think this is where people's knowledge of grazing and its impact on the rest of the environment is going to be superior to mine, and I will learn from whatever you have to say. As for fruit trees, these were an integral part of traditional wood meadows. Most of those that I've actually seen, and remember it's remnants of the traditional system which has been run down and there's surviving only as nature reserves, which are not always managed in a completely traditional manner. Where I've seen them, these are quite tall growing fruit trees, not these sort of short shrubs where you can reach over with your hand and pick fruits off the topmost branch because they're basically no taller than you are. So quite what damage grazing animals will do to big, tall, traditional orchard trees, I wouldn't like to say, but I do know that meadows in Britain, the grass in orchards in Britain used to produce some really good meadow habitats. You can look at the tithe maps in fact, I've looked at the tithe maps for Herefordshire, and quite often you can find woodland used as meadow on tithe maps. You can also, I remember in the 1970s and early 1980s, I spent a fascinating May day touring meadows in Worcestershire, which is after all next door, seeing some fabulous orchards, but also on the ground, fabulous meadows full of green-winged orchids. The two go together somehow, and I think these meadows must have been grazed as well during the winter, even with the fruit trees there. So more research needed, especially for me, or more information, more experience by other people needs to be brought to bear on what I say, but I wouldn't despair on their being incompatible. I think they must be compatible somehow because they have been in the past.
Dan, have you got any comments on the grazing side?
I think George gave a fairly comprehensive answer. When it comes to cherry and prunus species, again, I'm also not a grazing expert, and I imagine from my experience with horses, you do get individual animals that are a little bit naive and will do silly things sometimes. But as a general rule, I have grazed horses, cattle and sheep on sites with plenty of prunus species and never had any issues.
That's interesting.
If you did want to protect the trees from livestock, for example, if you were planting trees into an existing meadow where livestock were already part of the system, you would have to think about tree protection for the first few years at least.
Yes.
And so you could have a system, if you were worried about this, where you put up a more permanent barrier around some individual trees, as is often seen in parklands.
Yes, I think we're used to doing that in Herefordshire with our standard orchards. We've got a long tradition of those standard orchards and got a good guarding system. So I was wondering about, that's interesting, Dan, thank you. I was wondering about the protection of the coppice stools. Is that what people, do you call it in Yorkshire? Is it called dead hedging, something like that? Can you heap the brash on top?
You can, there's a slightly old-fashioned approach to pile brash on top of the stool, but that's somewhat frowned upon these days because various studies have shown that it can actually increase rabbit damage because the rabbits feel quite safe beneath the brash from raptor predation.
Okay.
And it can inhibit coppice regrowth. But dead hedging can discourage deer, and certainly the wood meadow systems in Europe that I've read about, fencing and hedging is part of that setup to protect coops for a few years after they've been cut.
Yeah.
We're at that point in the management of our site where we've just started the coppice rotation, and we're in the middle of trying to figure out what the most elegant solution will be for protecting the coppice from grazing livestock.
Great. It'll be fascinating to hear how you get on with that. We'd love to keep up to date with that. Thank you. Sue, is there another topic for questions?
Yes, we've had a couple of queries about the sort of spatial relationship between the trees and the grass. And I'm assuming this is probably something that's quite dynamic. Liz Overstall has asked, she says that some of your pictures, George, show wood meadows that are more woods than meadows. And from the picture, it appears that there's quite a closed canopy. So she's wondering about sort of the spatial relationship between the trees and the grass and and is there any sort of specific number that defines a wood meadow? How many trees? How much grass? And Samantha asked about pollarding. When shading becomes too dense, is it right to assume that the farmer will do a bit of pollarding to open up the meadow again?
Well, my learning on this is from reading rather than seeing. Sadly, I wasn't around in the 18th century, though it might look like it sometimes, to see these things in full working order. But the pictures you've seen are reasonably typical of what I saw. But I think what I saw was varying degrees of traditional wood meadow structures degenerating into something which inevitably becomes more covered in trees. So I interpreted this as seeing, well, I agree with the comment by your questioner that they look more like woodland than meadow. And I think that had we been able to be there in traditional wood meadow times, we wouldn't have thought that. It's just that you can't summon the resources to do all the management you probably would like to do on a nature reserve, even in Estonia, where they seem to be pretty on the ball about these things. I've not come across any sort of fixed figures about coverage of trees and grass as a sort of idealized picture, but it varied so much from one region to another in Sweden, where there have been studies of wood meadow structure, that I don't think there could be one single recipe that works everywhere. But certainly there are places where there's quite a lot of grass within the mosaic. The other thing, of course, you need to remember is that, as in anything you might produce, that within the management unit, some of the land may actually really be quite open. I mean, if I showed you a picture of an expanse of grass with no trees and said just over the horizon, it actually runs into a wood meadow, it's rather like that Scottish reserve. There's trees in part, not in other parts. And I think quite a number of these wood meadows are a bit like that, actually. Again, I'm talking about something which I saw in detail for 10 days and with one or two other instances in Sweden, and that's not really good basis for commenting generally. There are many studies, especially in Sweden, of wood meadows and their ecology. The problem, as the Swedes themselves pointed out to me, is that these habitats will be a lot more famous if everyone read Swedish rather than English. But they don't. In fact, a lot of Swedish ecologists will be far more famous than they are if the lingua franca turned out to be Swedish rather than English. So I think there probably is a lot of knowledge of that sort of thing if one cared to delve into it, but it could be quite a hard thing to chase up because of the language barriers. Where else? What am I talking about?
I think that covers it.
That covers
yes.
it. Well, I hope it does.
Yes.
Say it again if it doesn't.
Great. Thank you very much. We've got time, I think, for one more question, and then we must wrap up because we said 7:30, sadly. But so, Sue, is there anything?
Well, yes, we've had a couple. You know how it is. We tend to think of things as
What?
very. In Britain, we tend to think of things as either woodland, very specifically woodland, or very specifically grassland. But a couple of people have wanted sort of clarification on definitions. What is the difference between a glade, or how do we differentiate between a glade and a wood meadow?
Does it matter?
Is one.
Well, that's an interesting one. I wonder if your questioner is a lawyer.
No, actually, our questioner is Fiona Gomershall, and she's familiar with wood meadows. I think she's been involved in one in Shropshire.
I mean, there's a whole spectrum of different states of mixing grassland and trees. Within most woodlands, you're inclined to find glades or ride intersections or something like that. But you have everything. I'm sure I could find you a complete spectrum through to quite treeless grassland. And I, for one, don't have any need to make a sharp distinction between the two. Just recognize that there is a variable forms of mixing of grassland and woodland. It's the same thing. How do you define woodland? I mean, this is a pressing need if you're doing woodland censuses and have to measure their area. But until you do that, it doesn't really matter whether scattered trees or parkland, the density of trees in parkland, whether they count as woodland or not. It's only on some circumstances. And I think for most purposes, we just need to recognize that these two habitats can mix together in a whole variety of ways. And well, we'll call them what we like. Glades are smaller than meadows, as far as I'm concerned, and leave it at that.
Great, thank you, George. That's a really interesting thing to end on. So I think
can we just a couple of people are very interested in registering with Dan, so and we could send out details letting them know how to do that. And
absolutely, we'll do that.
And one or two asking about starting points, sort of starting with it if they want to start creating a wood meadow from an arable field with high phosphate index. Just be interested to know a bit about how you went about that, Dan, up in Yorkshire. So perhaps we can provide some links for people afterwards.
Absolutely, I'll give you my email address and you can pass it on to anybody who's interested.
Lovely.
And perhaps at some point in the summer, I'd be very happy to come down and meet some of you in person if there was capacity for that.
Fantastic.
Hooray.
That's a very kind offer. Yes, thank you. That would be absolutely wonderful. Interesting comments from people about, can we support, is an orchard meadow something we could explore more in Herefordshire? Absolutely, we've said that. So it's a form of wood meadow. It would actually very, very, very good. I think this idea of a complete continuum, this very broad spectrum that George has talked about, you can start with woodland and create wood meadow areas within your woodland and hope that the, what are the little white bells, the thing from Swanton Nova's come back in.
Lily of the Valley.
Yes, or you can start with a phosphate-laden arable field and work from there. So it's wonderful that there are so many possibilities. I think it's been really inspiring, George, to hear, to set it in this context.
You will have to plant the Lily of the Valley, I'm
yes,
afraid.
Well, okay, that's me. Being a Norfolk girl, I can just dream, can't I? So that's fantastic. I would like to thank our speakers very, very much, to thank George and Dan. It's very, very, it's been absolutely wonderful to kick off our series with this talk. I've got a million questions about carbon sequestration in different systems. I think we need so much. We're missing a lot of data and information, but that's going to be the topic of a future conversation. As Sue says, we will, as always, follow up with some links for further information. George has very generously said that as well as the recording of this evening's talk, the slides will be available on our website in perpetuity, which is extremely generous. Thank you very much, George. I'd like to thank Dan very much for joining us. It's great to meet you, and thank you very much to Rosalind for putting us all in touch and offering your support in the future. We really look forward to working with you. There's huge potential for, I think, great synergy in what we're doing. I forgot to say at the beginning, and he's in another room from George and I, but we'd like to very much thank Andrew Blake and the Wye Valley AONB team this evening for allowing us to meet here in their fabulous refurbished office in Monmouth. I don't know if you've noticed, the lights dim in an effort to save carbon. So if George and I have been sort of going in and out of brightness, that's what's been going on for their office. Thank you very much for hosting us. I'd like to thank Sue and Rory for all they've done this evening to make the meeting flow so beautifully. Before we close, then I'd like to just to say that our future events coming up in our Meadows, Mosaics and Mitigating Climate Change series We've got a couple coming up in March, through from March to May, really, when we start the full sort of summer survey and restoration season. So look out for those. And I think it just remains then for me to thank you all very much for coming along this evening. And if we were in the room, we'd give George and Dan a great big clap, but thank you very, very much. So lovely to see you all, and have a safe evening, and I hope the storm isn't too strong where you are. Thank you very much.